On a cold January morning in 1947, a young mother pushing her daughter down a Lowe's Angels sidewalk stopped because she thought someone had dumped a broken department store mannequin in the weeds of a vacant lot. It was not a mannequin. It was a 22-year-old woman, cut cleanly in half at the waist, scrubbed of every single drop of blood, and arranged in the dead grass with her arms posed above her head. And in nearly 80 years, no detective, no forensic scientist, and no confession has ever explained who did it. This is Lowe's Angels, 1947. The war is over, the movie studios are minting gods and goddesses, and every week 1,000 pretty hopefuls step off the train at Union Station, chasing a name on a marquee. It is a city of palm trees and floodlights and very long shadows, a place where a beautiful girl can disappear into a crowd and nobody notices for days. Her name was Elizabeth Short. She was 22 years old. The newspapers were about to give her a different name, one that would outlive everyone who ever knew her, the Black Dahlia. This is the story of the most famous unsolved murder in American history, and of the killer who got close enough to mail the police her belongings and was never seen again. The girl from Boston. Elizabeth Short was not a movie star. That part is myth, and we'll come back to it. She was a working-class girl from Medford, Massachusetts, born in 1924, the third of 5 daughters. When she was a child, her father drove his car to a bridge, left it there, and vanished. Everyone assumed he jumped. Years later, they got a letter. He was alive. He just walked away from his own family and started over in California. Elizabeth followed the same coast west. She had asthma, so she chased warm weather, Florida in the winter, California in the summer. She was strikingly beautiful. Pale skin, dark hair she wore in soft waves, and she favored black clothing. She drifted between rooming houses, borrowed money, charmed servicemen, and dreamed, vaguely, of something better than the life she'd been handed. By the end of 1946, she was in Lowe's Angels, sleeping on couches and in shared rooms, owing rent, running low on options. The last time anyone who knew her saw her alive was January 9, 1947. A married salesman named Robert Manley, everyone called him Red, dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown LA. She said she was meeting her sister. She walked through the lobby, out the front doors, and into the night. The 6 missing days. And then nothing. Stop and sit with this for a second, because it's the part of the case people skip past on the way to the gore, and it might be the eeriest thing in the whole story. From the moment Elizabeth Short walked out of the Biltmore on January 9th, to the moment her body was found on January 15th, there are 6 days. And nobody, not the LAPD, not the FBI, not 80 years of obsessed investigators, has ever been able to fill them. She didn't check into a hotel under her own name. She didn't call the people who knew her. She didn't show up at the rooming houses she usually drifted through. After her photo was in every paper in the city, hundreds of people came forward swearing they'd seen her, in a bar, in a car, on a sidewalk, downtown, in Hollywood, miles away. The tips contradicted each other. Not one of them ever held up. So here is what we are actually left with. For 6 full days, a young woman was somewhere in the city of Lowe's Angels, alive, at least at first, completely off the map. Somewhere with a door that locked. And we know, from what was eventually done to her, that she was not alone. Norton Avenue. January 15, 1947. A little after 10 in the morning. A housewife named Betty Bersinger was walking her 3-year-old daughter down Norton Avenue in the Lamert Park neighborhood, a half-built residential strip, full of empty lots waiting for houses that the war had delayed. She glanced into the weeds and saw something pale. Her first thought was that it was a discarded mannequin, the kind a store would throw out. She kept walking. Then her brain caught up with her eyes, and she ran to the nearest house and called the police. What the LAPD found in that lot is one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American history. And here is the first detail that tells you this was not an ordinary killing. The body had been cut completely in 2 at the waist, not hacked, not sawed in a panic. The cut was clean and surgical, made between 2 vertebrae, separating the torso from the hips in a single deliberate procedure. The 2 halves had been carried to the lot and posed about a foot apart. The arms were raised and bent above the head. The whole body had been washed, scrubbed clean, and drained of nearly all its blood. There was almost no blood at the scene at all. That last fact is the key to everything. A body that has been bisected and exsanguinated and washed was not killed here. It was killed somewhere private, somewhere with running water and time and no witnesses, and then transported and displayed in the open where it was guaranteed to be found. The Flinch. I'm going to tell you what the coroner found because the precision of it is the whole mystery. But I'm going to tell it the way a doctor would, not the way a tabloid did. The bisection wasn't crude. It was a technique called a hemicorporectomy, the surgical separation of the upper and lower body. It is taught in medical schools. It is difficult. It requires knowing exactly where to cut, and the killer cut exactly there, cleanly through the soft tissue and between the vertebrae, the way a trained surgeon divides a body without shattering bone. The blood had been drained the way a mortician or a butcher drains an animal. There were rope marks on her wrists, her ankles, and her neck. She had been bound. She had been held. The coroner's conclusion was that she did not die quickly, and that the worst of what was done to her was done while her heart was still beating. The cause of death was listed as hemorrhage and shock, and the bisection, mercifully, came after she was gone. And then there was her face. The killer had taken a blade to the corners of her mouth and cut outward, toward the ears, on both sides, a wound the world would later call the Glasgow smile. They left her with a final expression that was not her own. This was not rage. Rage is fast and messy. This was the opposite of rage. This was someone with a steady hand, a clean room, and all the time in the world. The posing, the washing, the open lot beside a public sidewalk where children walked to school, it wasn't an attempt to hide a body. It was a presentation. He wanted her found exactly as he left her. The Black Dahlia. The press lost its mind. Lowe's Angels in 1947 had a half-dozen daily papers all knifing each other for headlines, and a beautiful dead girl with a surgical killer was the story of a generation. Reporters from the Examiner found Elizabeth's mother in Massachusetts and told her falsely that her daughter had won a beauty contest, just to keep her talking long enough to get a photograph and her life story before the police could reach her. That's the kind of fever this case ran. And somewhere in those first days, a name appeared. The Black Dahlia. The papers said drugstore regulars in Long Beach had called her that, a play on a popular film noir of the time, The Blue Dahlia, mixed with her dark hair and the black clothes she liked to wear. Whether anyone really called her that before she died is debatable, but it didn't matter. The name was perfect, and it stuck, and Elizabeth Short, the person, began to disappear behind the Black Dahlia, the legend, on the very first day. The killer writes back. 9 days after the body was found, an editor at the Examiner opened an envelope. The killer, or someone who wanted very badly to be taken for the killer, had mailed it. Inside was Elizabeth Short's birth certificate, her social security card, her photographs, an address book with a man's name embossed on the cover and one page torn out. The whole package had been cleaned with gasoline to destroy fingerprints, and the items had been soaked so that whatever prints survived smeared into nothing. Pasted onto the envelope, in letters cut from newspaper headlines, were the words, "Here is Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow." More notes came in the same cut-and-paste style. One was signed, "The Black Dahlia Avenger." Another promised the killer would turn himself in, then taunted that he'd changed his mind. The police could never prove which messages were genuinely from the murderer and which were from cranks feeding off the frenzy. But the first package, the one with her real documents, the things only the killer could have had, that one was real. The man who cut Elizabeth Short in half had calmly gathered her belongings, washed them in gasoline, and mailed them to a newspaper. He was enjoying himself. A city full of suspects. The LAPD ran the largest investigation in the department's history. They interviewed something like 150 suspects, and then a strange thing started happening. Men began walking into police stations to confess. Dozens of them, more than 50 over the years. The detectives had a name for them, the Confessing Sams. Lonely men, drunk men, men who wanted to be famous or punished or simply noticed. Each one had to be checked and cleared, and each one buried the real trail a little deeper. Robert Manley, Red, the last man to admit seeing her alive, was hauled in, sweated, and given a polygraph. He passed. He was cleared. But the case haunted him for the rest of his life, and it eventually broke him. The real suspects, the ones still argued about today, all share one quality. They had medical training. Because the body told investigators something they couldn't ignore, whoever did this knew how to cut. One of those suspects was a surgeon named Walter Bailey, whose home sat just a block from where the body was dumped, and who was quietly losing his mind to a degenerative brain disease in the months around the murder. He died before anyone connected his name to the lot at the end of his street. But there is one suspect whose story is darker than all the rest, because the accusation didn't come from a detective. It came from the killer's own son. The doctor. His name was Dr. George Hodel. In the 1940s, Hodel was a wealthy, well-connected Los Angeles physician who ran a venereal disease clinic downtown, which meant he had patient records on half the powerful men in the city, and the surgical training to perform exactly the kind of cut that divided Elizabeth Short. He moved through LA's art world and its underworld at the same time. He was, by every account, brilliant, cold, and used to getting whatever he wanted. Decades later, his son Steve Hodel became an LAPD homicide detective, one of the best the department had, with a long record of closed cases. After his father died, Steve went through his belongings and found 2 old photographs of a dark-haired woman he believed was Elizabeth Short. That sent him down a rabbit hole into his own father's life. And what he found was this. Back in 1950, the district attorney's office had secretly bugged George Hodel's home for weeks because he was a suspect in the Dahlia case. On those surveillance recordings, George Hodel, not knowing anyone was listening, said the words out loud. "Sapassin, I did kill the Black Dahlia. They can't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." On the same tapes, investigators recorded sounds they believed were a woman being assaulted in the basement, and Hodel talking about payments and people who could no longer testify. The DA had a doctor with the skill, a near confession on tape, and a possible victim screaming in his house, and they never charged him. Why not? Hodel had connections, the bugging was legally shaky, the lead detective on the case may have been on the take, and within a year George Hodel quietly left the country for the Philippines and stayed gone for decades. He died in 1999, a free man, 91 years old. The truth. So before we end, let's separate what's real from what the legend added, because this case has been buried under myth for almost 80 years. The myth says Elizabeth Short was a glamorous, aspiring actress on the verge of stardom. She wasn't. She had vague Hollywood dreams like 10,000 other girls, but there's little evidence she ever seriously pursued acting. The starlet was largely invented by newspapers who needed a tragic ingenue. The myth says she was somehow asking for trouble. There's no evidence of that either. She was a poor, drifting, 22-year-old woman who trusted the wrong person. And the Hodel tapes, as chilling as they are not a conviction. A man muttering, "Sapassin, I did kill the Black Dahlia," into a hidden microphone is not the same as proof he did. It could be guilt, or it could be a cruel man toying with the police he knew were listening. Steve Hodel is certain. The LAPD never closed the case. Both of those things are true at once. But here is what is documented, confirmed, and beyond dispute. Elizabeth Short was held captive and bound. She was tortured before she died. Her body was surgically bisected by someone with real anatomical knowledge, drained of blood, washed clean, and deliberately posed in a public lot to be discovered. The killer then mailed her belongings to a newspaper. And in nearly 8 decades, with the largest investigation in city history and dozens of suspects, no one has ever been charged. It remains the most famous open murder case in the United States. What do you believe? So here's the question, and this one has 2 real sides. You've heard the tape. A respected doctor with the exact surgical skill, a near confession recorded in his own home, a daughter's photo and his belongings, and a son who spent his career catching killers pointing straight at his own father. If you believe George Hodel did it, that the answer was sitting in the family the whole time, protected by money and connections, drop a red circle in the comments. If you believe Hodel is just the most convenient story, a theatrical suspect we cling to because the truth is that the real killer was never named and never will be, drop a white circle. And then sit with the part that should keep you up tonight. Because here's the twist. One of those answers means a father confessed to murdering Elizabeth Short, and the city he lived in let him walk away to die of old age in his bed. The other means that after 80 years, the most famous murder in America is still completely, perfectly unsolved, and the man who cut her in half could have been anyone you'd have smiled at on the street. Which answer scares you more?